We'll now begin looking at the Roy Lopez, which begins after the moves e4, e5, knight f3 attacking the e5 pawn, knight c6 defending that e5 pawn, and white plays bishop to b5. Like I said, this is called the Roy Lopez, also called the Spanish opening, and it's seen really in all levels of play, from beginner to really, really advanced. And this is really one of the most popular openings that there is. I think if you look in the opening book, there are like, there's like almost 20,000 games in the opening book that have this move order. Black here usually plays the move a6. If black plays d6, this is called the Steinitz defense, but it's not that great because it blocks this bishop in. So white can really get away with playing just d4 here. And after bishop to d7, knight to c3, just normal development. Knight to f6, castle, bishop e7, rook e1. And in this position, black simply just has a cramped position. This bishop here is really bad. And after castling, we can trade off this bishop and play queen f3, hoping to use the f5 square later on. Not only does black have double pawns, white just has a more active position. Therefore, black usually plays the move a6 here instead of d6, and it forces white to make a choice. White can either move his bishop back or take the knight. Now, some people might think that taking the knight here wins a pawn. Taking the knight, they say, oh, if d takes here, then you can take on e5 and win a pawn. The problem is this doesn't actually win a pawn because black can play queen to d4, forking your knight and your pawn back. And after your knight moves away, the queen takes on e4 check, and no matter what you do, your king won't be able to castle anymore. Therefore, I recommend the move bishop a4. Bishop a4 because we don't really need to take the knight for a bishop. It doesn't really make sense to trade the bishop so early for that knight, especially since this bishop will be useful later on in the future. Black can play knight to f6 here, putting pressure on the e4 pawn. And now, surprisingly, white can ignore this attack on the e4 pawn and just play castling. When white ignores this e4 pawn attack, well, let's first see what happens if black does take the pawn. Now, this is actually very playable. This is called the open Roy Lopez, but you shouldn't worry about losing a pawn. For example, white should play d4 now. He puts pressure on the e5 pawn. And now, if black plays b5, we can put a bishop back on b3. If he ever takes on d4, then he loses because of the fork on the e file. For example, if d5 now, we can simply just take on d4, and we're once again threatening the move f3. Black will play d5 here, and after d5, then we can take the pawn on e5, winning our pawn back. If black continues developing with bishop to e6, then we play c3 to give our bishop the spot back, and to control the d4 square, which will become a post for us later on. Black will play bishop to c5 to try to control d4 as much as possible. And now, we can just play the move knight to d2. We try to trade off this knight, which is really in our territory, and we don't like it there. After castling, we put more pressure on that knight. And the only way for black to save that knight there is to play f5, trying to cement the knight there. And after knight to b3, the bishop goes back. We can control our own, or put this knight on d4. And after trading, we cement our own pawn, our protected pass pawn on e5, and we can chase the knight away with f3 anytime we like. We have the pair of bishops in this position. I think white should be doing fine. Now, black sometimes will choose to not take the pawn since he doesn't really win a pawn in that situation. And in this case, he'll play the move bishop to e7, which is called the closed Roy Lopez. Now, this pawn is still weak, and we can't have it hanging forever. We might as well play rook to e1 now and protect this pawn. Black plays b5, and now we can play bishop to b3. Now black plays d6 to try to get the bishop out. However, there's something I must point out here. There is a dangerous line in this case called the Marshall Gambit after castling c3 and d5 immediately. The idea is that here after e takes d5, knight takes d5, white can take on e5, which wins a pawn here, and c6. This wins a pawn, and d4. But the problem is after bishop d6, rook to e1, you might not see it, but black actually has a huge attack on the king side coming up. For example, he will start with playing queen to g4, queen to h4, sorry, and after g3, queen to h3. The idea being that he wants to play bishop to g4 and to f3 soon. For example, if you play bishop to e3, he'll follow immediately with bishop to g4. And when you go queen to d3, you have to play queen to d3 to stop bishop f3 with queen f1. Then he just plays rook to e8. Now you can play knight to d2, controlling these light, oops, not this one, this light square here. But he'll try to play rook e6 with ideas of playing the move rook to h6. However, he can't play that yet because your bishop's guarding it, so you can just play the move a4. And now, if black tries something like f5 to play f4, we can play queen f1, offering to trade the queens. If he moves his queen back, then we stop f4 by playing our own move f4. This bishop is fine because we have a pin on this diagonal. And if takes on a4, then we obviously need to take with the rook, not with the bishop. I mean, this position is interesting because white is down, or white is up a pawn, but this position has like, these pawns are not good for the bishop, and his pieces are just placed a little bit awkwardly. Black has chances in this position, and it's one of the most popular gambits there is in the Roy Lopez. But I think if white plays correctly, there should be no problem in this position for him either. If white defends accurately, black's attack should run out of steam eventually if enough pieces are traded, and white should just simply be up a pawn in the later part of the game. So after bishop b3, the main move is just to play d6, and now white plays c3, intending to play d4. After castling, however, white can't play d4 immediately. If white plays d4, black actually has this annoying pin on g4. The knight's actually very important in supporting the d4 pawn, so we can't afford to have the knight pin with bishop g4. Therefore, white must spend a move first, playing the move h3. And now black has a bunch of variations that he can play. There is the Chigorin variation with knight to a5, or the Breyer variation with knight to b8, or the Zaitsev variation with bishop to b7, or this variation with rook to e8, where rook to e8 is interesting. Let's first start with rook to e8 then. This is not really a good line, because if black wants to play this kind of line, white always has the option to draw with knight to g5, rook to f8, and knight to f3. Now either black must pick another line, or if he plays this again, then he needs to accept that there's going to be a threefold repetition. But if you want to play for the win in this opening, after rook to e8, you can also just go d4. If d4, then say bishop to b7, knight to d2, bishop to f8. Then in order to play our idea of knight to f1 and knight to g3, then we need to play the move d5. We close the center, preventing this idea of discovering the pawn on e4. And after knight to b8, then we can play knight to f1, our typical idea. Knight to d7, knight to g3. Similarly, after knight to b8, our idea is very common, d4, knight to b7. And I perhaps should clarify what the typical idea for this position is. The typical idea for this position is to play our knight to d2, then to f1, then to g3. On g3, it controls the e4 square, so in case black is attacking the e4 pawn later on, we have control there. And we can play the move knight to f5 later on in the game. f5 will be a post, because a lot of times this bishop will develop to b7. This knight a lot of times will come to h2 and come to g4, trying to trade off with this knight. And the idea is that after it takes, white can take either with the h-pawn or with the queen, creating an attack on the king side. And that's a lot of arrows, I know. So let's remove those arrows. It's important, though, that the main idea right now is just to play knight d2, f1, g3. This maneuver is very common. This bishop is in no hurry to develop. A lot of times it will develop to e3 after knight is established on g3 so that the e4 pawn is not weak. A lot of times it can also go to g5 to try to trade off with this knight, making the king side weaker. So let's just see what happens in this kind of position. White plays knight to d2. Black plays bishop to b7. And here, see, white can't play knight to f1 because he has two attackers against the pawn, and we have only one defender. Therefore, we need to play bishop to c2 to protect e4. And after rook to e8, then we can continue with knight to f1. If bishop to f8, threatening to take on here, adding an attacker to the pawn on e4, then we can just play knight to g3, threatening knight to f5 as well. If black plays g6 to stop that, and trying to fiend his bishop, then white also has the idea of making another weakness on the queen side by playing the move a4. The move a4 threatens to take here, opening up the file, and obviously if black takes here, then he's left with an isolated pawn on a6. Black may play c5 to put more pressure on the center, but then we can block his bishop in with the move d5. Now, black can play c4, giving this knight the good c5 square. But after bishop to g5, white's position should be still very playable, I think. Even more than playable. I think white's doing well here. When this bishop gets traded off with this knight, that's okay. Then we can once again move our knight here, move our knight there, and look for plans even with h4, h5 here. If black plays the date-set variation, h3, with bishop to b7 immediately, fianchetting the bishop, then we can just go with d4. This is very similar, rook to e8, knight to d2, and we have almost a transposition into that rook e8 line that I just showed. The main move is knight to a5, which is called the Chigorin defense. This one is a little bit different because it attacks the bishop on b3 and forces us to make a decision. Do we want to spend another move to move the bishop? And the answer is definitely. We definitely do want to spend a move to move the bishop and play the move bishop to c2. We play the move bishop to c2 for multiple reasons. First of all, we want to keep the pair of bishops. And second of all, if you think that this bishop here is not doing anything right now, it's actually defending the pawn. And third of all, this bishop later on, when this pawn is not there anymore, will control this nice long diagonal. So this bishop is very useful on this square, and I think it's definitely a good idea to put the bishop back on c2. After c5, we need to control the center anyway. d4 must be played. Black will continue to keep the tension with the center, with queen to c7. And after knight to d2, if everything gets traded off in the center after knight c6, then we need to play knight to b3. Notice how white keeps the center with tension as well. He doesn't commit by playing d5 or take the pawn. He waits for black to make the move. Remember that black doesn't really want to take here. If black takes here, then we can take here. This is a backwards pawn now. Or at least not a backwards pawn. It's an isolated pawn, but it seems backward because it's so weak. The d5 square is very well controlled, so that pawn will be attacked later on with a half open file. If a5, then we can play bishop to e3, and now if a4, our knight can come back since this bishop is now protecting the pawn. Once again, I think white's development is faster than black's, though white needs to be careful about these highly advanced pawns. I think white should have no problem in this position. Rook c1 later on will enjoy this nice open file. And even though he might have to postpone his kingside attacking activities a little bit, I think this position should be fine. White has more space in the center as well. A quick note, if he tries to attack you on e4, then it's okay to stop the pressure. I've never said that you can never play d5. I think that it's good to delay d5 as much as possible, but you can play it when you need to. d5, for example, right now is very good. If knight to c4, then just b3. And if knight to b6, then a4. Now white starts his own queenside counterplay. And a lot of times, since black's bishop is doing nothing on this diagonal anymore, he'll have to come back to c8. And white can develop normally with knight to d2, g6. And white can put more pressure on that b5 square with bishop to d3. Now white has two ideas. He can use the queenside and use the kingside. So we can see how that would work. For example, bishop to d7. Then white can decide to close the queenside with a5. And after knight to c8, then we can play knight to f1. And then after knight to h5, stopping knight to g3, then we can immediately go bishop to h6. Oops, bishop to h6. And if rook to e8, then we can line it up with queen to d2. This position should be pretty dangerous for white, and black doesn't have that much counterplay on the queen side since white already has his pawn on a5, and white has attacking prospects on the king side, so this position is very good. It's important to remember in this position that white needs to play the move h3 to stop the pin on g4, and then just play knight to d2, knight to f1, knight to g3, knight to h2, knight to g4. That's our idea. Two other lines you need to be aware of are the martial attack, which is after c3, after castling, c3, and d5. White should be fine here, but it requires some careful play, so if you're going to play the Roy Lopez, you need to study this carefully. And the other line here is the open Roy Lopez, where you know how to take the pawn back. So after castling, if knight takes e4, don't be afraid of losing this pawn. If you play d4, you'll get a good pawn on e5 as well. And this position is good for white.